As discussed in an earlier video, it is tempting to define a group you do not like by the worst people associated with it. This can easily lead to committing the fallacy of guilt by association. To illustrate, those on the left might be tempted to see the lockdown protesters as racist, because some associated with the protest have openly displayed racist symbols. Those on the right will often be tempted to see those protesting police violence as violent and destructive looters, because some associated with the protest have engaged in violence, vandalism, and looting. Not surprisingly, there is also an equal temptation to refuse to acknowledge bad elements of groups one likes. Given into this temptation can result in committing a version of what is called the purity fallacy, also known as the no true Scotsman fallacy. And this variation could be called the denial of association. This version of the fallacy occurs when a negative claim about a group, based on certain members, is rejected by asserting, without adequate support, that the alleged members are not true members of the group. As I noted before, the fallacy, the general version, is also known as the no true Scotsman fallacy, thanks to the philosopher Anthony Flew. To give an example of the fallacy in operation, if a Second Amendment rights group is accused of being racist, they might simply assert that those displaying racist symbols at their events were not members of their group. They might say they're not with us. So, to get formal about it, the version of the fallacy would have the following formal form. So, premise 1, negative claim P, has been made about group G based on M members of G. Premise 2, it is claimed, without support, that the members of M are not true members of G. Conclusion, claim P is therefore false. This reason is fallacious, because simply asserting that problematic alleged members are not true members does not prove that the claim is not true about the group. As always, it is important to remember that fallacious reasoning does not entail that the conclusion is false. A group's defender could commit this fallacy while the conclusion is actually correct. They would have simply failed to give a good reason to accept their claim. For example, going back to the example of the Second Amendment rights group, if they're accused of being racist and their defense is simply they're not with us, then they offer no evidence for this, to accept that the accusation of racism against them is therefore must be false, would be committing this fallacy. Now, the person's claim could be correct. It could be the case they're not racist, but simply asserting without any support that they're not with us or they're not true members of our group would not suffice to establish that conclusion. And as always with fallacies, it's important to keep in mind that a fallacy is bad logic. It doesn't mean that what's being said is therefore not true. A fallacy could have a true conclusion. The mistake lies in the logic. Like many fallacies, this particular fallacy draws its persuasive power primarily from psychological factors. Someone who has a positive view of the group has a psychological, but not logical reason to reject the negative claim without adequate evidence. Few people are willing to believe negative things about groups they like or identify with. In Flew's original example, a Scotsman refuses to believe a story about the bad behavior of another Scotsman on the grounds that no true Scotsman would do such things. So the idea is that if someone is doing something, bad associated with a group one likes or identifies with, that person is therefore must not be in the group. People can also reject such claims on pragmatic grounds, such as when doing so would provide a political advantage. So how does one defend against the denial of association? The main defense of this fallacy is to consider whether the negative claim is being rejected on principle grounds, to say it's justified, or is being rejected without evidence, purely on, say, psychological grounds or pragmatic grounds. One way to try to overcome a psychological bias is to ask what evidence exists to reject the claim. If there is no such evidence, then all that would be left are psychological or pragmatic reasons, which although they obviously motivate people, they have no logical weight. Now, sorting out who, belongs in a group can be a matter of substantial debate. For example, when people displaying racist symbols show up at gun rights events and lockdown protests, the question arises as to whether the protesters should be regarded, in general, as racist. Some might contend that those openly displaying racist symbols should not define the broader group of protesters. Others contend that by tolerating the display of racist symbols, the general group shows that it is racist, or at least racist adjacent. As another example, those peacefully protesting police violence generally disavow those who engage in violence, vandalism, and looting, and claim that the violent protesters do not define their group. Others contend that because violence and looting sometimes occurs adjacent to or after peaceful protest, the protesters are violent looters. Debates over group membership obviously need not be fallacious. If a principled argument is given to support the exclusion of the alleged problematic members, then this fallacy would not be committed. For example, let's make up a fictional Second Amendment rights organization. I think it's probably fictional. I will call them Anti-Racist for Gun Rights, ARGR. So suppose ARGR is accused of being racist because people at their protest displayed racist symbols. They had, Confederate flags, Nazi symbols, nooses, etc. Now, if they were to show that none of the racists were members of ARGR, and perhaps they had videos showing, ARGR members telling the racists to, get away from them because they're not racist and they don't want racism in their protest, that would not commit the fallacy of denial of association. As another example, if peaceful protesters can show that those who engaged in violence and looting are not part of their group, then it would not be fallacious for them to reject the claim that they are violent, when the claim is made on the alleged grounds that those who committed the violence are in their group, when in fact they are not in their group. So if you can, show that those who are associated with your group are not in fact in your group, then this would be not a fallacy. Now, sorting out which people belong to a group and how the group should be defined can be very challenging, but this needs to be done in a principled way. To define a group by the worst of those associated with it runs a risk of committing the guilt by association fallacy. Denying that problematic members are not true members of a group runs a risk of committing the denial of association fallacy. While both fallacies are psychologically appealing and can be highly effective as means of persuasion, they have no merit as arguments.